All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thank you for supporting us at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. I'm happy to welcome today's guest, David McCormick. He served as Chief Executive Officer at Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's largest investment management firms, before pursuing a U.S. Senate seat in his home state of Pennsylvania in 2022. He was also the U.S. Treasury. He was the U.S. Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs and held senior posts on the National Security Council and at the Department of Commerce. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy, a former Army paratrooper, and a veteran of the First Gulf War. And he's the author of a new book, Superpower In Peril, a battle plan to renew America. David McCormick, welcome to the news.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me, Matt. Good to be with you.
Had a hard time getting through that extensive bio, but I wanted to include it because I think it's incredibly, it's just a great bio. And every single thing on there, I think, speaks to your credibility as a politician and as an author. So thanks for being here. I do want to start with politics and then move more to the book. But in the book, in the beginning, you talk about this meeting that you took at Mar-a-Lago with President Trump. I guess you were running for U.S. Senate against Dr. Oz, and you caught wind of the fact that President Trump might be making an endorsement. You went to Mar-a-Lago. Tell us what happened.
Well, we were, first of all, thanks for having me. And it's great to be here. The book was really a labor of love that started well before the campaign because it was the same motivation for writing the book for running for office, which is I felt the country was headed in the wrong direction. So Superpower In Peril is that, it reflects that view. And we can talk about that in a minute. But well into the campaign, I had thought that President Trump may endorse Mehmet Oz because they were friends and had family connections and so forth. But my hope was to keep President Trump on the sidelines. And so when I heard he was going to endorse, I flew down there and I got a meeting with President Trump. And I had said some things on Bloomberg when I was the CEO of Bridgewater that he didn't love about, there was a question about polarization. I had said that I thought President Trump contributed to it as one of many leaders and that we needed to move past that. And President Trump then said to me he thought that I needed to say the 2020 election was stolen in order to be able to win the primary in Pennsylvania in 2022. And I told the president that I wouldn't say that, which was really consistent with what I had said on the campaign trail. And the irony of this was I was running a campaign that was very aligned with many of President Trump's policies. I thought then and think now, and it's in the book, that many of his policies on the border and on economic policy, as well as the approach to China, were moving the country in the right direction, rather. And so that led to a rush till the end of the campaign over the next 3 or 4 weeks. President Trump came to Pennsylvania, and I was still winning in the polls despite his endorsement of Oz. And then the president not only endorsed Oz, but then criticized me in a number of ways. And as a consequence, it was a very close race, and I lost by 900 points. There was 1.4 million votes cast, and I lost by 900 votes. And obviously it didn't help to have the president endorse somebody else and then attack me. But when you lose by 900 votes, there's many, many things that you could have done as the candidate to win. And so I take full responsibility for the fact that I didn't win the campaign, although the campaign was a great life experience, and it was really a great honor to do it.
And I have to ask before we move on, I mean, there are rumors that the Republican Party might want to clear the field for you. This time you'd have a clean shot running in 2024 against Senator Bob Casey. You want to make history, make an announcement here today? How's that looking?
The reality of it is if you're motivated to run for office and you throw yourself into it the way we did because you want to try to help and you lose by 900 votes, it's not like the motivation to serve goes away. My wife and I were really committed to trying to do this. So we're asking ourselves, what's the best way to serve? So we're certainly thinking about the Senate seat in 2024. It's a very significant personal decision. So we're thinking about it, praying about it, and we'll decide at some point in the coming months. Right now, the focus is on in getting these ideas and Superpower In Peril out there, because whether I run for office or not, I believe the future of the country depends on really putting new conservative policies and principles in place. I think we're at risk of really going in the wrong direction, or we are going in the wrong direction. And so I think we need to have leaders who run for office who can win primaries and win general elections, and who can bring forward a vision for taking the country in a different direction. And that I don't think we can look backwards. I think we have to look forwards. And so whether I run or not, I'm hoping that this book, Superpower in Peril, can contribute to that.
And in part, the book's about how to renew America, but it starts talking about the fact that America is and has been for a while in decline. Talk about that.
Yeah, it starts with something I think we all kind of know. We all feel it. We feel that economically we're sliding backwards. We have a $31 trillion debt. We have 40-year highs in inflation. We have less mobility than ever before. The likelihood of starting in the fourth quartile socioeconomically and getting to the third, second, or first is lower than it's been. We have all sorts of spiritual challenges with progressive ideology hijacking some basic concepts that have been so fundamental to America, and that's why 80% of Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction. So we're in decline. And the book cover, as you held it up there, is very ominous. It's red and blue. It's superpower in peril. I believe that. I believe we're at an inflection point. And yet, if you've read the book, it's a very optimistic book, because I believe there's a path forward. And decline is not inevitable, but neither is renewal. It depends on what we do. So this is meant to be the what we do book, and so I talk about a number of things to do, but in essence, it's the things I mentioned. We have to fundamentally rethink how we educate our people and our children, but also skilled workers, to create a workforce that can take our country forward. We have to rethink how we confront China and have a whole of nation strategy for doing so, and we need to rethink how we secure America in terms of our military, in terms of the social media platforms and big tech, and in terms of institutions. Because one of my big fears is, you could have all the great policies in the world, but if you don't have leaders and institutions that are carrying that mission, that purpose forward, you're not going to renew America. And so it's a big lift, but I'm optimistic there's a path forward. And if I can take a minute on it, the reason I'm optimistic is I've lived through it before. It's the American tradition. We get to the edge of the cliff and we pull ourselves back. And I remember it, Matt, pretty well. When I was 14, 15, it was the Carter administration, 78, 79. We had record high inflation, 16%. The economy was in recession. We had record high gas prices. There was something then called, you're too young to remember, odd days and even days, where you can only go for gas on the right day. I remember sitting at the pump waiting, and my dad had the Country Squire, which was a station wagon about a half a block long. And we had Desert One, which was this horribly mangled mission to try to rescue our hostages in Iran, where we lost 8 service members. It feels a lot like Afghanistan. And so at that time, 1979, 80% of Americans thought the country was heading in the wrong direction. And it feels a lot like that today, where the country's heading in the wrong direction. And the reason I'm optimistic is 4 years later, I was a plebe at West Point, walking down those walkways in those beautiful mountains, looking out over the Hudson Valley, and it was morning in America. The economy was on fire, inflation was in check, entrepreneurism and new businesses were thriving. The military was getting a boost of investment and a boost of confidence that led to the end of the Cold War 6 short years later in 1989, and you could feel it. And Ronald Reagan's leadership changed the direction of the country and renewed America. And I'm not suggesting the same things Ronald Reagan did then are what we should do now, but I am suggesting that good ideas, good conservative thinking that reflects the challenges of our time, and inspirational, optimistic leadership that's the formula for American renewal.
You were born in Pittsburgh. I remember the first time I went to Pittsburgh was about 25 years ago. I was working for the Leadership Institute. We went up there to do a little campaign training seminar. And I remember I was expecting it to be smokestacks and just, the Rust Belt, what you think of when you think of that. And then we came, under that tunnel or whatever, and it's like this shining city on a hill. It was like gleaming, beautiful. And I ended up kind of falling in love with Pittsburgh. I've been many times since. Um, Talk about how Pittsburgh, may serve as something of a metaphor for your thinking.
Yeah, well, it's a very important part of my life. Pittsburgh, as you said, was where I was born. It's after the Army. It's not where I grew up. I grew up near Scranton, Pennsylvania, but I came back after the Army to Pittsburgh, and I ran a business there. And it was on that beautiful, shiny skyline. Our sign was in neon. It was called Free Markets, and it was a tech startup that went public. It was the hot tech company in Pittsburgh, and we were, I don't know, about 1,000 people by the time soon after we went public, and it was a big deal in Pittsburgh. But free markets was really reflective of an incredible evolution that has happened in Pittsburgh, where you had the combination of civic leaders, university presidents, um, business leaders, entrepreneurs coming together to really paint a vision for Pittsburgh that went well beyond the death of the steel industry. And I talk in the book. I used to live in the East End of Pittsburgh, and where I actually have a home now. And I had a couple of kids at the time, babies there, and I took them in stroller, and I'd go for a run. And I'd run through Shenley Park when I could look down on the Monongahela, and you'd see the old shells of the steel factories. And then I'd go up through Oakland and into the Hill District, which was the old show African American neighborhood, very challenged economically, which is the old show Hill Street Blues. And then I come back down through University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, which became the core of the research public-private partnerships that brought the Robotics Institute and eventually Google and all these companies to Pittsburgh, and then back up through the Hill District. And you saw just in one 6 or 7 mile run all that had happened in Pittsburgh to take it in a new direction. It now has a huge life sciences industry and based around UPMC. It has a huge artificial intelligence and robotics. The artificial intelligence lab for the U.S. Army is there. And Pittsburgh, it still has its challenges, but is a completely reinvented city. And that's a lot of the spirit of what I'm proposing in the book. It's the building blocks of education and technical skills that our workforce needs, combined with leadership in key technologies and a national strategy for leadership that's based on significant investment in R&D, plus the government playing a role in creating incentives to draw private capital to the industries that have the most strategic geopolitical advantage. Plus treating, and this is a huge thing within Pittsburgh, treating data as the critical strategic resources it is. There was this Economist cover about a year ago that said data is the new oil. And I talk about this in the book that no, data is not the new oil. It's strategic like oil, but it's even more powerful in the sense that you can use data over and over again. And it's a driver of innovation. And we don't have a data strategy. We don't have a privacy strategy in America. And yet data is going to be critical to America's future. And this is where the Chinese have a huge advantage. It comes at the expense of individual freedom and liberty, but because they're a techno-authoritarian country, they can take all the data and use that to great effect for their innovation strategy. And so Pittsburgh draws on all that I think is necessary for renewal and more. And so I use the Reagan Revolution and the Reagan Renewal Morning in America as one example, and I use the Pittsburgh Renaissance as another to say we've been here before, we know what to do. Now we just need to go do it. And this book is here's the roadmap, here's the blueprint of what we could do to renew the country.
You and I are both fans of Ronald Reagan, and I'm a little concerned that some people now, it seems like, maybe going after some Republicans, some people on the right may be going after Ronald Reagan, and I don't like that. But I also think that times change, and so as you noted, the challenges that Reagan faced aren't necessarily the same. And B, even though I think Reagan deserves so much credit for restoring faith and optimism in America, defeating the Soviet Union, there were trade-offs that were made, and there were people who got left behind in that process. And so maybe it's time to adjust a little bit. And one of the things I really like about your book is I think that's kind of what your book is about, to be honest. As a big, you wrote a whole book about it, so it's a huge question. But if you would just talk maybe at the macro level about kind of combining Reaganism with this populist moment in a way that doesn't become demagogic or toxic.
Yeah. Well, that you're right. That's what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to do it as someone who's been a conservative my whole life, someone who believes in some basic premises of conservatism in terms of the power of individual liberty and freedom, the notion that government is conceived to serve the individual, not vice versa. That small government is the best government. That America's exceptional, and America's exceptional role in the world needs to be preserved because it's good for America and good for the world. And so those things I hold dear. But what's happened, and President Trump tapped into this in 2016, is the system hasn't worked for a lot of Americans. A lot of blue collar Americans haven't benefited from the great boom in growth and wealth creation that's happened in America and around the world over the last 20 years. So our system, free trade, globalization, it hasn't benefited, and in fact, it's hurt. It's hurt many Americans in certain ways. And if you, in the last 20 years, if you had assets, at which 10% of Americans have assets, you got a lot richer. And if you didn't have assets, you didn't get rich at all because real income stayed flat. And so what's clear is that when you drive through Pennsylvania, I think through much of the country, no, it's not been great. It's not been great. They are struggling. Inflation is taking a huge bite out of their ability to live a high quality life. Fentanyl crisis is hurting all of America, but particularly some of these challenged communities. 20 years of war, 2 decades of war has come disproportionately from the lower socioeconomic quartiles. Crime is having the biggest impact in places like that. So you add it all up, and they're angry. They're really frustrated, and so I try to take that frustration and acknowledge it, and it has merit. They have a right to be frustrated because the system hasn't worked. So then I try to say, okay, given our current reality, what would be a set of practical policies that both stay true to core principles of conservatism, but also acknowledge and adjust our policy framework to deal with the realities of today. In doing so, we can serve our country better. We can create American dream and opportunity for all. But it also is the basis for creating a coalition of conservatives that can win elections, because there's a big chunk of them that feel like the Republican Party or no party has served them well. And so that's what I'm trying to do. So a good example of this is how we talk about China, and the impact on China has had on our communities here in Pennsylvania, around the world, and the fact what globalization has done. And so I have a whole chapter about in Superpower In Peril about how to bring key industries home because of the strategic benefit of them, of how to limit certain types of investment abroad because it enables the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA, and how to hold China accountable for the bad behavior and ensure reciprocity, which was a key principle that Trump argued for, but also his trade rep Lighthizer argued for, which I think it has merit, and I think is an important consideration when we think about our trade relations. So there's pieces of that where I embrace right up front that I'm deviating from some of traditional Republican orthodoxy, and I think with good reason. And so those are the arguments I make. There's a point in the book which you may have come across, which I asked, what would Milton Friedman say about some of the policies I'm recommending on technology leadership and the incentives we need to create to bring private capital into technology. And I don't know what Milton would say about what I'm proposing, but what I would say to Milton is your approach isn't winning. We're losing key leadership in critical technologies due to a hands-off, laissez-faire view on what's required. And the semiconductor industry is the most obvious example of an enormous strategic oversight that we should all feel embarrassed by, that 90% of the semiconductors in the world and what we need are manufactured 90 miles from mainland China. So that's the thrust of what I'm trying to do. And you're right. I think it has practical appeal. I think it's intellectually coherent. And I think it's what America needs and Republicans need to take the country forward.
Yeah, look, I'll say this. You don't have to say it, but I think Donald Trump was very smart politically to recognize that there was this constituency out there who Republicans had left behind and they were hurting. I don't think he had a lot of policies to help them. And so maybe that's the next wave is actually Republicans doing something. But to China, let me ask you this question. I know you worked in the Bush administration, and Bush, I think, had some would say quixotic, others might say an optimistic view that people everywhere just want to be free and that you could spread democracy. Republicans, even before Bush, I think, made this hopeful bet that by opening up China, we could not only get free trade and cheap consumer goods, but we could help bring democracy and liberalism to China. Do you now believe that that was a mistake?
Well, I was in the Bush administration beginning in 2005, and my responsibility was I was the Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration, which is that job is in the newspapers all the time these days because that's where decisions are made about which technologies are exported to China and around the world. And so from the very beginning, I never had much optimism that by creating an economic trading relationship with China, that you'd somehow see them become more human rights focused and bring democracy and so forth. I don't think there was any reason to believe. I think that was quixotic. I don't think those who believe that there was ever much of a reason to believe that, given the thousands of years of history in China and the evolution of the Communist Party there over the previous 60 years. However, there was also a second bet that was more tangible, which is by giving China access to U.S. markets and by giving the U.S. access to Chinese markets, there'd be a mutually beneficial trade relationship that would benefit both countries. And that would have economic benefit, but also have national security benefit. That bet, even when I was in the government, was starting to show itself to be room for skepticism. And I saw it firsthand. And I wrote about it, gave speeches about it, and I even tried to put in some policies or did put in some policies to restrict it. But the Chinese were stealing an enormous amount of technology. There was enormous intellectual property theft. Not long ago, the one of the nation's highest intelligence officers said it's the greatest example of thievery in the history of the world, and that's true. Trillions of dollars of technology and patents and intellectual property stolen, and I saw that firsthand. And in addition to that, there was absolutely no, even from the very beginning, at least from my engagement, a notion of reciprocity, that you get true market access. It was extremely selective. And it was clear that the Chinese were trying to build indigenous industries, many of which were critical to their military capability as well. So take that from 2005, fast forward, by 10 years later, it's a much more dire situation than we would ever imagine because President Xi comes into office in 2014. And whatever direction the Chinese was on, which was deviating from U.S. interest, that's accelerated dramatically. Xi's view of the world, the view of China, its desire to replace the United States as the leading superpower, its techno-authoritarian philosophy that it tries to impose on others, that became more apparent. And so both parties have been sleepwalking for quite some time. And really, to President Trump's credit, he was the first one who brought clarity to that challenge in a way that started to bring some more common sense to it. And I think you now have as much of a bipartisan consensus the other way today in 2023 as you had referred to in 2004, 3, 4, 5, 20 years ago. And I think it's warranted because I think China poses an enormous threat. And as I say in the book, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I say in the book, China has a plan for global primacy. What's ours? And sadly, we don't have a plan. And so the book is meant to be the plan. What we do to go to the gym, to build the muscle at home, to be able to compete with any adversary in the world, particularly with China, technologically and with data and with education, and also how we should deal with China externally and how we should manage our dependency and strategic decouple to bring key industries home, how we should stop investing in China in ways that are going to help the Chinese grow capability against us, and how we set some hard lines around things like Wuhan and the COVID virus. The fact that we haven't held China accountable for that, where it seemed obvious from the beginning, despite what the liberal media said, that there was probably a connection from the virus that emanated in Wuhan and the lab that studies such viruses in Wuhan. But for some reason, we're just now getting to that. So that's the whole of nation strategy that we need in terms of confronting China, while at the same time, you've got to be in the gym and do the hard work of building our strength.
So I agree with you. China is an existential threat. And I actually agree. I think Donald Trump did change the tone of America toward China. I think there's more a sense now that they're at least an adversary, certainly not an ally. Having said that, I think Trump sends a lot of mixed signals with China. Like I remember him sort of celebrating the anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And he kind of sucked up to their leader, who was, obviously an authoritarian. And Trump also killed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I don't know that much about trade. I'm not an economist or anything like that, but a lot of smart people tell me, like, if you wanted to manage China, that was actually the number one policy you could have implemented, and Trump got out of that. So how much credit should Trump be getting on China, really?
Well, I think he should be getting a lot of credit in the sense that he fundamentally shifted the nature of the conversation, I think, in the right direction. And the policy discussions that are happening now are pushing America in the right direction vis-a-vis China, although we lack a coherent, comprehensive strategy. I'm agreeing with that point, and that's what Superpower In Peril tries to lay out. In terms of the point you make about transatlantic partnership, without getting into the ins and outs of some of the flaws in that deal, I agree wholeheartedly that a key part of our China strategy has to be deep relationships, aligned relationships with our allies in trade, in national security, in technology policy, because in data policy, and I argue that in the book, in the chapter on data in Superpower In Peril, all of that is critical because China is trying to build alliances going the other way. The one with Russia at the moment is a good example of that. And so that alliance strategy is really critical. We cannot, should not go it alone. And we need to do it in a way that is recognizing that new reality. And that's where I give President Trump, there was lots of opportunity for lots of presidents and lots of leaders to crystallize the challenge, and none did, and he has.
Yeah, I'll say this so you don't have to, because I want you to run for Senate. I have a chance. But like, it sounds to me like a theme here is that Donald Trump showed up and he was this like radical shock force that shifted paradigms, in some cases in bad directions. In some cases, I would say, like in our view toward China, for example, our view toward working class, blue collar Americans as Republicans in a more positive direction. But other people, it will fall to them probably to actually
Carry it forward.
build a
Yeah.
coherent policy framework.
Essentially what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to call it straight down the middle as I see it. So I try to approach this with saying, here's where we are as a country. Here are the problems. I think big picture, the fact that President Trump tapped into that group of voters and recognized some of the flaws of the system and channeled those in a way that brought attention was all great for the party and requires now a coherent response for how to take the country forward. And so I try to give the President Trump credit where I think it's warranted. I try to say where there's gaps and where I think we should move forward. My most important point I'm trying to make in the book is we have to look forward. We have to have a plan for the future. And that renewal is not going to happen based on some ground up sort of thing. It's got to be a vision for what America can and should be going forward that's tied to all that's wonderful and unique about America, but also is recognizing the unique challenges of our time. And I think that's will be the test for 24 of who can bring such a vision forward. I think that's a winning political vision. I mean, what do I know? I'm not a political pundit, but I don't think when I travel around Pennsylvania and go to diners and VFWs, I don't think people want to spend 80% of their time looking backwards. I think they want to spend 80% of their time looking forwards and talking about how to fix the problems and the challenges that confront America. So that's why I'm optimistic. I think we'll find that vision. I hope this book humbly can contribute to that. And I also think if we can find leaders that can, energize people, win elections, to put good ideas in practice, I think that's a winning formula.
Last question about China, but it's just so important. Um, we were asleep at the switch for a decade or more. They've stolen a lot of intellectual property. We're now sort of enmeshed with them. Our companies are entangled with them, and um, is it too late? Can we actually? Is it possible? We never get back some of the technology that they've stolen, but if if we try to turn this around, is it too late? And if not, like what? How do we begin that process?
Well, no, I don't think it's too late. I think as I outlined in the book, Superpower in Peril, I think there's a clear path, but it starts with some of the fundamental flaws in the Chinese system. So China has its own problems, huge demographic challenges, huge indebtedness problems, huge challenges creating their own middle class and being able to create their version of the Chinese dream, where people have social mobility and opportunity. Huge challenges, and we have a track record, sort of a DNA around resilience and our capacity to, overcome mistakes and move forward very, very quickly. There's lots of examples. Examples abound. Just as a micro case, let's look at what happened with COVID, and let's look at what happened with the vaccines and the capacity of American companies in America to innovate in a way that addresses an enormous pandemic challenge. And then contrast that with China's response, the lockdown, followed by the very mediocre and somewhat ineffective viruses, including the ability, unwillingness to cooperate with other countries around the root cause, and then a complete whiplash of opening China up almost overnight due to the protests and so forth. Just look at that track record, and you see the enormous ability and capability of the United States when directed in the right direction, and you see some of the underlying flaws that will make it hard for China to sustain its success and growth. So there's a lot we can do, and a lot of work we can do in terms of taking our technological abilities and taking our capabilities forward. But we have to act, and the key to acting is just like in business. If you're a CEO, you got to confront the problems, lay them out there and stare at them, and acknowledge them and get to the root causes. And then you got to put plans in place, and you got to hold yourself to a high standard to execute. So one of the things I try to do in the book of Superpower in Peril, it's kind of a wonky policy book, as you know. It's a little bit of a political book, because I talk about how the policies are related to people I met all through Pennsylvania throughout my life. But then it's a leadership book, because I talk about the kind of leadership that's required to build winning teams, to be successful in times of adversity, and most of all, to take America in the right direction.
Now, I mentioned in your intro that you were the CEO of Bridgewater. So I want to ask you about these ESGs, which I think stands for environmental, social, and governance for climate change. It's been in the news a lot lately. And my understanding basically is that if you're managing someone's pension fund, instead of worrying about returning the highest, profit or return on their investment, you also need to factor in progressive social justice issues as well. I'm assuming Bridgewater is doing this. I don't know if it was an issue at the time when you were CEO, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Well, Bridgewater is not really doing it. I can come back to what Bridgewater is doing in just a second, or at least wasn't when I was there. I've left more than a year ago, a year and a half ago. But essentially, this comes down to who gets to decide. Who gets to decide, right? So if you want to take money out of your pocket and you want to buy a pair of sneakers that are hand sewn and under a certain, with organic materials, with a whole agenda that costs, $20 more than a pair of similar sneakers that are manufactured, wherever in an assembly line. That's your choice, and that's totally appropriate. And if somebody else wants to go buy Black Rifle coffee because Black Rifle coffee has, a strong connection to veterans and so forth, that's great too. The problem is when somebody else gets to impose their agenda on your money, And that's exactly what's happening with ESG. And there's a variety of different people imposing it. So there's pension plans in certain states, particularly blue states, that are imposing ESG standards where they're saying we want to manage money in a way for our pensioners that reflects ESG principles, where we're not going to use fossil fuels or we're not going to do a variety of other things, and that would be diminishing the fiduciary responsibility relative to those other social objectives. So that's a problem, because if you're a pensioner and you don't want that agenda, well, then you need to have an option out. As long as you have an option out, as long as people are making individual choices, I don't think there's a problem with it. It's when there's institutional choices made on your behalf. But beyond that, there's money managers who are imposing things. And BlackRock's the best example, where BlackRock went to many of the companies that invested in and say, we're only going to invest in you. So we have capital on behalf of our customers. We're only going to invest in you if you meet a certain set of standards. And I think that's a bridge too far too. And what you're seeing now is that tension, that conflict, where states like Missouri and Texas and others are saying, hey, we're not going to do business with anybody that's requiring anything. And that's where the tension lies. And I think it's very problematic. And I think it's emblematic of a broader progressive agenda that's permeating the business world, our military, our institutions. A good example of this is, listen, I'm an environmentalist. I have a property. I've invested a lot of my time and resources to try to protect that property and the environment and keep it pristine. But the Army issued a climate strategy under Joe Biden before it issued its warfighting strategy. That is the kind of hijacking of our institutions and our agenda to make America great that is very concerning. And so that's the problem. In Bridgewater's case, just to finalize it, I think we had the insight to know that some customers wanted an ESG sort of investing, and we gave them the option to do that. But we never imposed it on anybody. So we never think you can define ESG whatever you want it to be. So if you want to say certain things I won't invest in, other things I will invest in, then we could construct a portfolio that would show them the trade-offs, and they could make their own choices of what makes sense for them. That seems very coherent and consistent to me. Let individuals, their money, decide how it should be spent. And if there's a political agenda, they can invest in it.
Sounds good. All right. We're almost out of time. As always happens, we've barely scratched the surface. But before I let you go, I'm sure there was many things that I didn't ask about, maybe something that you want to leave the audience with from Superpower in Peril.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'd say there's a line, as a good conservative, you probably remember this line. There's a line from William F. Buckley at the end of the book, and it says, citizenship is both a privilege to be a citizen in the most exceptional country in the world, but also responsibility. So we have a responsibility to preserve it. And my worry when I talk to younger people, and particularly with the way our history is taught, they don't necessarily wake up understanding and realizing that we'll only preserve America if we choose to, if we do something about it. And so that's what this book is in some ways about. It's a call to service. It's a call to a purpose, to get America back on track. And everybody can contribute in different ways. I tried to contribute by running for the Senate, but there's lots of ways to contribute. But that's the American way. And so that responsibility lies within each of us. And that's the kind of motivation I'm trying to inspire with writing this book and laying out some specific things that we can do.
All right. The book is called Superpower in Peril, A Battle Plan to Renew America. David McCormick, thank you for coming on the news.
Matt, thanks so much for having me.